When I was considering my purchase of the dashboard system, I had never used a track saw or an MFT style workbench. So I wondered about some really basic things. Things I worried might be considered stupid questions. Well, my teacher in middle school would have said that there are no such thing as stupid questions, but there are lots of stupid people asking questions. He was a bit weird. Let's not talk about him anymore. Moving on. So one of my questions was, how long should the rail for the crosscut configuration be? The one that goes on the hinge. What rail is compatible? The short answer, if you're using Festool's regular length rails, the short answer is the 1080. That's probably the one you want. But there's a longer answer, and if you're interested in more details, stay tuned. The guide rail attaches to the dashboard guide rail brackets using the slot on the bottom of the guide rail, and it attaches at 2 points. On the rear bracket, this T-bar is going to slide into the slot. And on the front bracket, you install a spiral dog, and you want it to drop into this elongated notch here on the front part of the bracket. The T-bar on the rear part of the bracket, as it slides through the slot on the guide rail, can go anywhere. It'll slide the entire length of the rail if you want. So it doesn't really matter. Similarly, the spiral dog also slides anywhere in that slot that you want it to go. This is my 180 millimeter rail set up with the end of the bracket roughly equal to the end of the guide rail for no particular reason. And I have the spiral dog resting approximately halfway through that slot on the front part of the bracket, which is what Rob recommends in his videos. Here's the same guide rail, but I slid it forward a couple inches or so, and the T-bar is still engaged. Why I would want to do that, I don't know, but I want to point out that there's nothing preventing you from doing it other than concerns about whether the attachment of the guide rail to this bracket is sufficient. Note that when I did this without changing the spiral dog's position, it doesn't fit into the front rail anymore. But I could just move the spiral dog back and have it fit into that slot again. Similarly, I can move the guide rail further back if I want to. In this configuration, I have the same rail, but now the front of the rail is flush with the front of the front guide rail bracket. And I've moved the spiral dog close to the end of the rail so that it will still engage. And in order to do this, I had to move the rail back, and it is now sitting 11 centimeters overhanging the back rail, which is difficult to see. And you might do something like this if the overhang in the front was in your way for some reason. For this shot, I've pulled the rail back so that it overhangs 28 centimeters beyond the end of the rear guide rail, which is 280 millimeters. The reason I did this is because Festool, I believe, sells an 800 millimeter rail. And by pulling it back 28 centimeters, I'm simulating an 800 millimeter rail so that I can show why I think it won't work. And that is, it's not long enough to have a spiral dog inserted and reach the front bracket. This is why I think the 1080 is probably the smallest standard size Festool rail that will work on the standard size dashboard in crosscut configuration. So that's really the only major constraint, is that the rail needs to be long enough so that the rear is sufficiently connected to the rear bracket, and the front is long enough to have a spiral dog that engages properly with the front bracket. Can the rail be too long? I don't think the dashboard will care, but it can be too long to be convenient. Having a rail that would be too long might be awkward. Also, it's important to remember that the notion of long enough can vary depending on what configuration you're using with your dashboard. For example, here I've added the wingman mounted on my front guide rail bracket, but I've kept the same 1080 millimeter rail attached, and I have not moved it forward. And when I do that, I have to move the spiral dog forward, and I can still reach the slot, but just barely. So it's not clear that the 1080 is long enough for this configuration. Maybe if I moved the rail forward just a bit, it would work, but I'm definitely on the boundary here somewhere. And of course, if the 1080 isn't long enough to reach with just the wingman installed, it's not even close to long enough to reach if I'm using an outrigger instead. So here I've switched to a 1400 millimeter rail, which I have once again mounted with its end flush with the rear bracket edge. And I still have the outrigger, and now the front guide rail bracket is there. And in this configuration, the rail is just long enough to reach the front rail bracket. If I were to put the wingman on, the 1400 would be too short. Here's an example of the question of whether a guide rail can be too long. I've moved the outrigger out of the way, and I put the front guide rail bracket on, but I've left the 1400 millimeter rail on. For this configuration, I have to move the spiral dog way away from the front edge so that when I lower it, the spiral dog will engage. But now I have a great deal of overhang on the front of the bench, and that overhang is likely going to be in my way while I'm trying to work. Of course, there's no reason that extra overhang has to be in front. The spiral dog and the T-bar for the rear will go anywhere in the slot you want. So here I have taken the same configuration, except I moved all that extra overhang to the back by sliding the rail back. This might get it out of my way when I'm working in the front, but it increases the rear clearance of the bench with respect to whatever is behind it. So now I've mounted a 1900 millimeter rail, again flush with the rear edge of the rear guide rail bracket. And now, without an outrigger, the overhang is, of course, getting absurd. So this configuration would seem silly. However, Rob has a video where he demonstrates a full sheet crosscut and points out that you need at least a 1600 millimeter rail to be long enough for that to work. And a 1900 is long enough, in fact, longer than necessary. So here's that same 1900 millimeter rail with an outrigger and the wingman, which is the configuration that Rob points out for a full sheet crosscut. And there is considerable overhang because I had to move the spiral dog quite a ways back, but not so much overhang that it's a huge problem. And this is a configuration that will get the job done. It seems very likely that a full sheet rip is the only scenario where one might need a crosscut rail this long. It is possible to do rips in the crosscut configuration. The dashboard won't stop you, and I've done it and can confirm that the track saw police do not show up and arrest you. However, for the vast majority of cases, rips are going to be better handled on the front with the guide rail mounted lengthwise on the bench instead of along the blue strip. And as long as I'm talking about configurations that are possible but likely not useful, this is the 1900 millimeter rail with two outriggers stacked together and the front guide rail bracket on that. And the length for this configuration works out pretty well without too much overhang. I don't know why anyone would do this, but it is possible to stack your outrigger. So that's probably more information than most people want about the length of the crosscut rail on the dashboard. But I will say one more thing. I have wondered on several times whether there could be one rail to rule them all. Is it possible that I could put one rail on and have it work for all situations? And I think the answer is no. Most of the time I leave the 1080 on the dashboard. But it's not long enough for some of the configurations that I showed. The only other candidate is the 1400. I've considered leaving it on all the time, but as I showed, it overhangs so much that it's annoying when I don't have an outrigger on. So the one rail to rule them all idea probably isn't feasible. Fortunately, it's not difficult to swap rails when I need to make a change.